Somewhere in Cupertino right now, a finance executive is staring at a spreadsheet that shouldn't exist. A single line item, one component, one tiny part sitting on the MacBook's logic board has moved so violently in price that it is threatening to blow up the margin math on Apple's entire laptop lineup. Not a chip shortage caused by a factory fire, not a war, not a natural disaster. A memory chip, the most boring, most overlooked, most forgettable part of any computer has, in a matter of months, become expensive enough to add real, painful dollars to the price of a MacBook, and depending on which configuration you're looking at, some of the numbers being thrown around aren't a 10% bump or a 20% bump, they're closing in on double. Reports and supply chain leaks have pegged the swing at close to 98% on certain memory-heavy builds. Let that sit for a second. 98%. That's not inflation. That's not a normal market correction. That is a supply chain in genuine crisis, and Apple, one of the richest, most powerful companies that has ever existed, is not immune to it. And here's the part that makes this story actually worth your next 10 minutes. While American and Korean memory giants are the ones getting squeezed by this shortage, there is a Chinese company almost nobody outside the industry has heard of that is positioning itself as the release valve, a company that didn't exist a decade ago. A company building memory chips at a moment when memory has quietly become the most contested resource in the entire technology world. This is a story about a $100 part turning into a $1,000 problem, and about who's stepping in to fix it while the giants are looking the other way. I'm going to walk you through exactly why this happened, why it's so much worse than people realize, who's actually responsible, and why the company riding in with the fix might change more than just the price of your next laptop. Stay with me till the end, because the last part of this story is the one that should actually worry Samsung and Micron the most. Let's get into it. To understand why a MacBook can suddenly cost this much more, you first need to understand something that almost nobody thinks about when they buy a laptop. Inside every single computer, phone, and server on Earth, there are two very different kinds of memory doing two very different jobs, and for the last 2 years, one of them has been quietly strangling the other. Think of it like this. Imagine a city with only one power grid. For decades, that grid supplied electricity evenly. Homes, offices, factories, everyone got their fair share. Then suddenly a handful of massive new data centers move into town, each one hungry enough to consume the output of an entire neighborhood on its own. The grid doesn't grow overnight, so what happens? The homes start getting brownouts, not because the power plant broke, because all of its output got redirected somewhere more profitable. That's basically what's happening to the memory industry right now, except the power plant is Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, and the hungry new arrivals are AI data centers. Here's the technical piece you need, and I promise I'll keep it simple. The AI boom runs on a special type of memory called high bandwidth memory, HBM for short. It's the memory that sits right next to the most advanced AI accelerators, feeding them data at insane speeds so they don't sit idle waiting for information. Every major AI lab on the planet wants more of it, and they are willing to pay extraordinary prices to get it. The problem is that building HBM doesn't just use a different production line. It eats up wafer capacity that used to go toward ordinary memory. Micron has openly said that producing a given amount of HBM can require something like 3 times the manufacturing resources needed to make the same amount of standard memory. 3 times the resources for the same output. That's not a small shift. That's the power grid getting torn up and rerouted toward a handful of buildings. So picture the 3 companies that basically control the world's memory supply. Samsung, SK Hynix, Micron. For years, they made regular memory the boring, reliable way, and everyone from Dell to Apple to your local PC builder bought from them without a second thought. Now, all 3 of them are racing each other to build more HBM because that's where the money is. That's where NVIDIA and every AI lab on the planet are throwing checks. Every wafer that gets redirected toward HBM is a wafer that isn't making the regular memory that goes into your MacBook, your gaming PC, your phone. The penthouse suite is expanding, and the ground floor apartments are emptying. And when the supply of something shrinks while demand stays the same or grows, you already know what happens to the price. It doesn't creep up, it explodes. Now let's talk about why Apple, specifically, got hit so hard by this. Apple's entire MacBook lineup runs on what's called unified memory. Instead of a separate graphics card with its own memory pool, Apple's chips share one big pool of high-speed memory between the processor and the graphics engine. It's actually a brilliant piece of engineering. It's part of why MacBooks feel so fast and efficient. But it comes with a catch that's biting Apple hard right now. Because memory is unified, Apple can't just slap a cheap, low-spec chip into the base model and call it a day. Every single MacBook, from the base configuration to the maxed-out Pro, needs a meaningful chunk of this now scarce, now expensive memory just to function properly. There's no version of a modern MacBook that gets to dodge this problem. The shortage doesn't hit the top-end model harder than the entry-level model. It hits every single unit rolling off the line, and Apple doesn't build laptops on demand the way a boutique PC shop does. Apple locks in massive, long-term supply agreements, sometimes negotiated a year or more in advance, based on price assumptions that made sense at the time they were signed. When the underlying memory market moves this violently, this fast, those old contracts either get renegotiated at brutal new terms, or Apple eats a margin hit that no company, not even Apple, wants to eat forever. At some point, some of that pain has to move downstream to you, to the person about to click buy on a new MacBook. That's the mechanical reason prices on certain configurations are reportedly jumping by numbers that sound almost fictional. It's not greed. It's not some secret Apple tax. It's the unavoidable output of a memory market that has been completely reshaped by the AI boom, hitting a company whose entire hardware philosophy makes it uniquely exposed to that exact problem. Here's where the story usually stops for most channels. Prices went up. Blame AI, end of video, but that's the lazy version, and it skips the most interesting part entirely. While Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron are all racing toward the incredibly profitable HBM gold rush and leaving the ordinary memory market thinner and thinner, a new player has been quietly filling exactly the gap they're abandoning, and it's not an American company. It's not a Korean company. It's Chinese. The company is called XCMT. Changshin Memory Technologies. If you haven't heard of them, that's kind of the point. They were founded in 2016, which in memory manufacturing terms is basically yesterday. Samsung's semiconductor history stretches back decades. Micron goes back to the late 70s. SK Hynix traces its lineage through a long series of mergers going back even further. XCMT walked into this industry against three giants who already had the factories, the engineering talent, the customer relationships, and decades of manufacturing knowledge built up through multiple generations of chips. That's not a fair fight on paper, but here's the thing about fights that aren't fair on paper. Sometimes the side that's supposed to lose picks a completely different battlefield. XCMT didn't try to out-innovate Samsung on the bleeding edge of HBM. That would have been suicide. Instead, they focused almost entirely on the exact space the big three were walking away from: ordinary conventional DDR5 memory, the kind that goes into everyday laptops, desktops, and yes, potentially devices exactly like the ones Apple builds. While Samsung and Micron were pouring billions into HBM factories chasing NVIDIA's checkbook, XCMT was quietly scaling up production of the boring stuff nobody was fighting over anymore. And here's the number that should make you sit up. XCMT is now reportedly producing memory dies with capacities up to 24 gigabytes and advertised speeds pushing toward 8,000 megabits per second. That's not toy-tier memory. That's a real modern DDR5 product line, and it's arriving at the exact moment the traditional suppliers have created a gap in the market large enough to drive a truck through. There's already evidence this isn't theoretical. Chinese DRAM from XCMT has reportedly started showing up inside memory modules sold under recognizable consumer brands, hidden underneath the same heat spreaders people trust without a second thought. That matters more than it sounds like, because the hardest part of breaking into a market this concentrated was never really the manufacturing. It was convincing anyone to take the risk of trusting an unproven supplier. Once a component starts appearing quietly inside real, shipping products, that wall of distrust starts eroding fast. First, it's a regional product, then another brand qualifies it, then a bigger customer takes a look. That's exactly the pattern that turns an outsider into part of the normal supply chain, and XCMT looks like it's somewhere in the middle of that exact process right now. So when Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron all decide the real money is in HBM and start quietly deprioritizing the ordinary memory market, they're not just making a business decision. They're opening a door, and XCMT is the company standing closest to it, ready to walk through. Now I want to be completely honest with you here, because this is exactly the point where a hype-driven video would just wrap up with XCMT saves the day and roll credits. I'm not going to do that because the real picture is a lot messier. And you deserve the messy version. First, there is no confirmed on the record statement from Apple that XCMT chips are heading into MacBooks. None. What we have is a supply chain under obvious extreme stress, a company that makes perfect strategic sense as a release valve, and a track record of exactly this kind of quiet substitution happening in other consumer products already. That's a strong circumstantial case. It is not a confirmed fact, and if anyone tells you otherwise, they're getting ahead of the evidence. Second, there's a real qualification gap. Apple runs some of the tightest, most demanding component testing in the entire consumer electronics industry. A memory supplier doesn't get anywhere near a MacBook logic board without surviving months, sometimes years, of stress testing across temperature ranges, voltage margins, and long-term reliability data. XCMT has proven it can ship competent DDR5 into mainstream consumer products. Whether it can clear the bar Apple sets for its own devices is a completely different, much higher bar, and nobody outside of Apple's supply chain team actually knows the answer to that yet. Third, even if XCMT does end up somewhere in Apple's supply chain, directly or indirectly through a module partner, that alone will not instantly fix the pricing crisis. This shortage isn't just about one supplier being unwilling to sell. It's about total global memory capacity getting reshuffled toward HBM faster than new capacity can be built anywhere. XCMT adding meaningful volume helps. It does not magically undo an industry-wide supply crunch overnight. Anyone promising you MacBook prices snap back down the moment XCMT enters the picture is oversimplifying a genuinely complicated economic story, and there's one more wrinkle worth mentioning, honestly. Even China's most advanced domestic chip companies still rely, in parts of their supply chain, on manufacturing equipment and processes that trace back to foreign technology. Full end-to-end independence is still more of a direction than a finished destination. XCMT filling the gap in ordinary DRAM is a real, meaningful development. It is not the same thing as China's memory industry becoming instantly self-sufficient across every tier of the market. So here's the honest, unglamorous version of this story. Apple is facing a real, painful, well-documented cost crisis on its memory supply, driven almost entirely by the AI industry's insatiable appetite for HBM. XCMT is a real, rapidly scaling company sitting in exactly the right position to benefit from the gap that the crisis has created. Whether the two of those facts connect directly inside an actual MacBook logic board is still something we're watching unfold in real time, not something that's already been confirmed. But here's why I think this story matters even if that specific connection never gets confirmed publicly. Step back from Apple for a second and look at the shape of what's actually happening across the entire memory industry. 3 companies used to sit at a table that basically nobody else could reach: Samsung, SK, Hynix, Micron. For decades, if you wanted serious volumes of reliable memory, you went through one of those 3 doors, full stop. Now, because of a technology shift none of them fully control, the AI boom's appetite for HBM, all 3 of them are voluntarily walking away from a huge chunk of the market they used to dominate without a second thought. And into that vacuum steps a company that didn't exist 10 years ago, backed by a government that has made memory independence a stated national priority, arriving at the exact moment the door was left wide open. This is the same pattern I've talked about again and again on this channel. A wall goes up, or in this case, a market simply gets abandoned by the players who used to own it, and instead of that space staying empty, someone moves in and fills it faster than anyone expected. Nobody planned for CXMT to become relevant because of an AI-driven HBM shortage. That's not how strategy usually works. Usually it's opportunity meeting timing, and right now the timing could not be better for a hungry, fast-scaling Chinese memory maker. And think about what this means beyond just laptops. If CXMT keeps climbing, keeps qualifying with bigger brands, keeps producing higher density chips, it's not just Apple's cost sheet that changes. It's the entire negotiating position of every company that buys memory at scale. Right now, if Samsung, SK, Hynix, and Micron all decide together that HBM is more profitable and quietly let conventional memory prices run wild, buyers have nowhere else to go. A credible fourth supplier changes that conversation completely, even if that supplier never captures a majority of the market. Sometimes you don't need to win to change the game. You just need to become impossible to ignore at the negotiating table. So here's my honest take on all of this for what it's worth. I don't think this is a simple story of Apple getting punished or China riding to the rescue like some kind of hero. I think what we're actually watching is what happens when an entire industry reorganizes itself around one new, incredibly lucrative technology, and every company touching that industry, whether they're based in Cupertino, Seoul, or Hefei, has to figure out how to survive the reshuffling. Apple didn't do anything wrong here. They built a brilliant unified memory architecture that happens to be uniquely exposed to a memory crisis nobody could have fully predicted 2 years ago. Samsung, SK, Hynix, and Micron aren't villains either. They're chasing the most profitable opportunity of their entire company histories, and any business would do the same thing in their position, and CXMT isn't some underdog fairy tale. They're a company that spotted a gap created by other people's decisions and moved into it with real speed and real engineering. What I find genuinely fascinating is how a shortage nobody was talking about 18 months ago has turned into one of the biggest hidden cost drivers on the most popular laptop lineup in the world, and how the fix for that shortage might end up coming from a company most consumers have never heard of, sitting inside a country most people don't associate with consumer memory chips at all. Here's the question I actually want your honest answer on, because I think this one's genuinely split. If it turns out Chinese memory is quietly the thing keeping your next MacBook from costing even more than it already does that change how you feel about buying one? Or at that point, once it's buried inside a sealed logic board you'll never open, does the origin of the chip stop mattering to you at all? Tell me exactly where you land in the comments. I read every single one, and I think this is going to be a genuinely divided comment section. If this kind of story is the reason you're on this channel, the hidden economics, the supply chain fights nobody's covering, the moves that quietly decide what you pay for the tech you actually use, then this is exactly what Iron Circuit exists for. I'm not here to give you the headline everyone else already gave you. I'm here to dig underneath it until you understand the actual machine driving the story. So if you want to keep seeing this stuff before it becomes mainstream news, hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, because I promise you the memory story is nowhere close to finished, and I'll be breaking down exactly what happens next the moment it does. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.